Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another edition of Mormon Stories Podcast. I am your host, John DeLynn. It's June 4th, 2024, and we are now in part two of this brand new, exciting series that we're launching on what I believe, and many believe, is a groundbreaking book on Mormon history. The book is entitled Second Class Saints, Black Mormons, and the Struggle for Racial Equality by Dr. Matthew Harris. We just recorded episode 1 yesterday, and what we're doing is like the LDS discussion series. We're planning on hopefully a 10 to 20 episode series where we're going to be digging in depth into this book. This book not only talks about the Mormon Church's priesthood and temple ban on Black people, some Black people, for over 150 years. It's also a really important insider look at how Mormon church leaders are influenced, how they make decisions, the political intrigue, and just kind of how the sausage gets made. We believe this is a historic book. I've already said it's one of the maybe top 3 most important books I've ever read about Mormonism. And really quickly, just to remind you all, this series continuing is dependent on your support. We want to pay Matt generously for not only his scholarship, but for his time that he's taking to dig in depth. This is sort of a director's cut podcast to take you behind the scenes of this book, because this book, while it was 300 or 400 pages long, could have been much, much longer and had to be edited down. And then there's so much that Matt knows that even wasn't included in the early drafts. So this is a director's cut insider view of the inner workings of the Mormon Church as it relates to race. And we need your financial support if you want to see this continue like the LDS discussion series. The way to do that is to go to donorbox.org/Matt Harris and become a monthly donor. And as long as, let's just say, 50 of you step up to donate $10 a month, maybe 100, because we want to do multiple episodes a month. Anyway, let's just say 100 of you step up to do $10 a month. We'll be able to pay Matt what he deserves to keep this going. So please, again, donorbox.org/Matt Harris. We'll include that link in the show notes. And without any further ado, let's bring back into our panel Gerardo Simano, the reason I know anything about Matt Harris. Hey, Gerardo.
Hi, John.
And Gerardo, this is an issue you care about deeply as well, right?
Yes, yeah, for sure.
Yeah. And Matt, tell us in 20 seconds your background, just for those who are joining us for the first time.
I'm a professor of history at Colorado State University, Pueblo. I went to BYU for my grad and undergrad, and then I went to get another master's degree in PhD at the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs in Syracuse, New York. And I specialize in civil rights, race and religion, legal history, and the Constitution, all the controversial stuff. And anyway, I've been writing and researching and publishing in Mormon history for, well over a decade now. So it's a privilege to be here and talk about my work.
It's our pleasure. Really quickly, if you're listening or watching this episode before the release I believe is in early July 2024, you can pre-order. We'll include a link to Amazon to pre-order the book. Please start purchasing this book now. Go to Amazon right now and buy this book. We want to flood the earth with Second Class Saints because it's a really important book. And we also welcome our Never Mormon audience. We're going to work really hard to make this episode and this series accessible. And we'll say this series is enjoyed best when you start from the beginning. So whether you go to the playlist on YouTube to watch this in order, or you go to Spotify or Apple Podcasts, you can watch these episodes as their own podcasts, and you can binge watch them versus having them intermingled in the Mormon Stories podcast feed. Now, before we jump in, we were talking about our plan from the beginning, Matt, to incorporate Black Mormons or Black ex-Mormons into this discussion. Do you want to talk about that really quickly? Because we know that we're 3 non-Black guys right now talking about the Black experience within Mormonism, but that is not how this series is going to end, correct?
Yeah, I think it's critical that we get Black voices on the show.
Women voices too, but keep going.
Yeah, men and women. And the one of the things I did in my book was it was really, really important that I get as many Black voices as I could in terms of how they understood Mormon racial theology, how they understood the ban, how it affected them. And I'd like to do the same thing for this program to get just a perspective from a different voice about how this theology affected them, and also how the lifting of the ban in 1978 affected them.
Yeah. So please be patient with us. We wanted to get the kinks out of our structure and our dynamics before we started adding panelists, but it's coming. All right. So, Matt, do you want to kind of give a quick recap of what we covered last time and how we left it off? And then we'll jump right in.
Yeah. So yesterday in our first episode, our debut episode, we talked about the prophet Joseph Smith, his views on Black people. We talked about how he ordained some Black men, or at least people under his direction, ordained Black men to the priesthood with his consent. And we talked about a Black Latter-day Saint woman named Jane Manning James, how she petitioned various church leaders for her temple ordinances and was essentially denied in most of these requests, except for the baptisms for the dead that she and some other Black saints were allowed to do. We talked about how priesthood ordination had abruptly shifted with the second prophet president, Brigham Young, in 1852. He publicly announced that there would be a ban on the priesthood. And undergirding that ban was his fear of interracial marriage. There were a couple of Black Latter-day Saint men who were engaging in polygamous affairs with white women that unnerved Brigham Young. And we also talked about an important Latter-day Saint priesthood holder named Elijah Abel, that he served several church missions for the church. He was able to get his washings and anointings done, a limited temple ritual. And he too was denied, like Jane Manning James, he was denied the opportunity to get it sealed to his spouse in the temple, which is a prominent temple ritual that prepares Latter-day Saints for the afterlife. And we left off yesterday essentially on page 6, where we're going to start to talk about interracial marriage in earnest and how that undergirds much of the church's teachings about racial matters.
Yeah. So lots of states in the United States made interracial marriage illegal. How did the Utah legislature or the territorial legislature, whoever it was, how did they handle it?
They used fractions. So in 1888, looking at my book here, in 1888, the Utah legislature had passed a law. This is really with Brigham Young's influence as the leader of the state, or the territory rather. So in 1888, just 10 years after Brigham Young died, they passed the first interracial marriage laws in the state of Utah, which barred Black, white, and Asian people from intermarrying. And then by 1939, they expand the law that prevents a mulatto, a quadroon, or an octoroon from marrying a white person. And just to give people a sense of how this plays out, a mulatto is anyone in the law that has one white and one Black grandparent. A quadroon is one Black grandparent and 3 white grandparents. And an octoroon is one Black great-grandparent and 7 white great-grandparents. So one of the things that we left off yesterday is that race is a construct. These are just fractions that lawmakers had created to define someone who is Black. And the church will buy into this. They'll alternate. The state legislature will use the fractions, but the church will even go one step further, and they'll use the one-drop rule, which is an old slave plantation rule that they created in the 1830s and 40s to prevent interracial sex between slaves and non-slaves. And so the one-drop rule simply means that if you had 100 people and one of those 100 had African ancestry, or one drop, as it were, they would be deemed Black. And by 1930, the census codifies the one drop rule into law, which means that if anybody in a household had one drop of African ancestry, they would have to click the box that said Negro, as they said in those days, or colored. So anyway, these are very draconian racial constructions. And maybe, John, this is a way to launch into Susie Young Gates from here.
And I'll just say we covered last time that we all have a drop. Not only do we all have a drop of African blood in us, but like we have drops of Neanderthal, blood in us. Like there's no such thing as a human being without drops of African blood. Probably a lot of them, including blonde hair, blue-eyed Aryans, or whatever the word would be from Western Europe, right? Sweet.
Yeah, it's really interesting because a point that I made yesterday that I want to emphasize again today is that the priesthood and temple restriction of the church is based on lineage, not black skin. That's hard for a lot of people to imagine. So what that means is if you have one drop of African ancestry, you're deemed black or cursed, as it were. But if you are from Fiji and you have really dark skin, the church didn't believe that Fijians were derived from Africa. And so they could hold the priesthood even though they had dark skin. So theoretically, it's possible that you could have a white-looking person, Caucasian-looking person with an African ancestor in their line, their family tree. They could be denied the priesthood, but yet somebody with very dark skin from, say, Fiji could hold the priesthood. So it wasn't based on skin color, it was based on lineage. And that's what really made this interesting.
I have a question about that, Matt. Do you have a sense whether this was an unintended consequence of the one drop rule where obviously, you talked about yesterday how the ban was imposed by Brigham Young based on his fear of interracial marriage or interracial sex. So, and obviously he had to scare Latter-day Saints away from that practice, right? And that's likely what was behind the ban. So are these all these issues that came later, like you're talking about, where you would have someone that appeared to be white but that had African ancestry? Is that an unintended consequence of the ban?
Yeah.
We don't want to get too much into this because we cover this in a later chapter, but go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, I was going to say in chapter 2, Gerardo, we talk about, it's called racial passing, that chapter. And what that means is that light-skinned Latter-day Saints of African descent, much like Americans in general who have light skin, in those days they called them mulattoes. Today we would use the word mixed race or biracial. But for these biracial Latter-day Saints who are light in skin color, they would pass below the color line. That is, they would pass as white instead of identifying as black, because obviously if they pass as white in the church and also in American society, they would get more privileges. And so in chapter 2, I talk about at great length how they pass as white, also and how the brethren, leaders of the church, recognize that this is going on. And we'll talk more about that when we get to chapter 2, but they know what's going on. And just to give listeners a teaser, that a couple of the church leaders think that it unfairly penalizes light-skinned people because they can pass as white and achieve the priesthood, whereas dark-skinned people don't have that luxury. Yeah. And so it leads to a proposal to ordain what they call part Negroes to the priesthood. Yeah. So anyway.
Yeah.
All right. So interracial marriage in the Utah territories is banned. Let's switch to kind of, I think we're now getting to kind of early 20th century, what type of legacy, practical legacy, Brigham Young's policies leave the functioning church.
Yeah, it's so the legislature, they're influenced by his leadership. Even though he dies in 1877, his influence still is strong. And so they're passing these laws based on his views and the church's views on interracial marriage, this idea that bloodlines are pure and they ought to be unsullied by these interracial marriages. And I should add, just to be really clear, and as the careful scholar that I strive to be, it wasn't just a law that prevented black and white people from marrying. It was also a law that would prevent people of different racial and ethnic grounds from marrying. So in other words, white people were not supposed to marry Chinese people, let's say, or Asian people in general. So it wasn't just black and white. It was a whole number of racial and ethnic groups. And all right, so that goes on in the early 20th century. This is going on all throughout the American South. Interracial marriage laws are in place, and they won't be lifted until 1967 by the United States Supreme Court in a famous court case called Loving v. Virginia. Some of the states will get rid of their interracial laws before that, including Utah. We can talk about that later. But anyway, so these interracial marriage laws are in place. And this leads us to an interesting character in Mormon history. Her name is Susa Young Gates. She was a prominent Relief Society member in the early part of the church. She was Brigham Young's outspoken daughter. She had a mind of her own. She was extremely intelligent. and didn't like always taking direction from priesthood leaders. She was a leader in the women's suffragette movement when Mormon women in the early 20th century were far more active in political and social causes than they are today, I would argue. Anyway, she wrote a book that the sisters in the Relief Society used that was really, really important. And it's a 600-page book that that looks at tries to link the world's genealogy to the world's racial history. So she's looking at racial patterns around the world. And much of her book talks about interracial encounters and interracial migrations. And she says something interesting. She says that these groups that were crisscrossing the globe had a distinctive strain or lineage that became blurred over time through interracial marriage. So she acknowledges this in the book, but she doesn't really quite comprehend what that means. That if you have different racial and ethnic groups crisscrossing the globe, that means that they're violating the one drop rule. And this is completely lost on her. And when she writes the book, she has 3 of the apostles sign off on the book, and one of whom is a rising superstar in church circles. He's the son of LDS Church President Joseph F. Smith. And this, of course, is Joseph Fielding Smith. So Joseph Fielding Smith, Anthony Lunn, who would later become Joseph F. Smith's counselor in the first presidency, and also an apostle named Charles Penrose. They look at Sister Gates's book, they read it, they review it, they make some comments, but it goes completely over their head that this entire book negates the one drop rule, that the whole world has been crisscrossing in motion for a number of years. And what's interesting about all of this from these interracial migrations is that it leads to a new nomenclature of how we identify these mixed race marriages and their mixed race offspring. So you get mestizos and mulattoes and a whole number of new names that pop up to describe these mixed race children that correspond to their new mixed race identities. So anyway, the point that I want to make is that there is no such thing as a pure white race. And there is no such thing as somebody having one drop, since we've talked about that each of us, if we go back 200 years, each of us has at least one ancestor with African and Native American ancestry. And the brethren don't quite know this yet in the early 20th century. This is scholarship that's unfolding with a German anthropologist named Franz Boas, who teaches at Columbia University. He and his students are among the leaders in identifying that race is a construct. It's something that people have constructed to make sense of different peoples around the world. So Mormon leaders in general are stuck with this idea that there's a pure white race, when the fact is it's just something that's built on fiction.
Really quick, Matt. One term that I think can be experienced as very offensive, especially to white people, is the term white supremacy. And what I take from this, I mean, it was clear Brigham Young was a white supremacist in any definition of the term. And I don't mean to use a term that's loaded or charged. I'm just trying to be technically accurate. And I think that term would just de facto apply to Brigham Young, but it also applies to these early, high-level Mormon church leaders in the early 20th century, correct? This idea of a pure white race, that's by definition white supremacy. Am I overreaching there?
No, you're using a modern term to describe something that goes back for a number of years. And just to go back further, European people in let's say the medieval era, so the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries, they follow this Aristotelian idea. So the philosopher Aristotle had argued that there's a great chain of being in the world. And everything was rank ordered, from the plants to animals to people. And in this great chain of being, white people were at the very top. And of course, slaves and black people would be at the very bottom. And Mormons, like other Protestant Christians and other Christian groups, picked up on this racialized hierarchy, as I call it. And there's no question that Latter-day Saints believe that white people were the chosen lineage. And we talked about yesterday, this concept called British Israelism, which is that the lost tribes of Israel were really nestled in Scandinavian countries. And Latter-day Saints looked at that theology that was taught, and they argued that the chosen lineages derive from these Northern European countries. And of course, these are white countries. And so that was part of that great chain of being, or that racialized hierarchy. And in the 20th century, early 20th century to mid 20th century, Latter-day Saints frequently talked about the chosen lineage being essentially white people. And so we tend to equate the white supremacy with, let's say, the Ku Klux Klan today, and it is a loaded term. But there's no question that Americans in general, in the early 20th century, they believed in white supremacy. They believed that white people ought to run the government. They believed that white people ought to teach schools. They believed that white people ought to be doctors and physicians and ought to play a leading role in the leading occupations of the country. So Latter-day Saints were not unusual in privileging whiteness at that time.
Okay, great. Thank you. If it's okay, let's jump to the part of the book where John Taylor and Joseph F. Smith have some brief interactions with Elijah Abel. And I know that we may have touched on this last time, but just for the sake of the chronology and kind of the story, now that we're getting into post-Brigham Young prophets, let's just really quickly talk about John Taylor and Joseph F. Smith's interactions with Elijah Abel. That's okay.
Yeah. So Elijah Abel, his interactions early on were with Joseph Smith, and it's one of those classic examples or cases in life where a certain leader treats you a certain way, and the expectation is that leader's successors will follow in that same vein. And that was not the case with Elijah Abel or Jane Manning James, for that matter. And so the prophet Joseph Smith had expressed great affection for these two Black Latter-day Saints, but that affection was not returned by his successors, particularly Brigham Young, also John Taylor. And as the church, when John Taylor, the third president of the LDS Church, when he was ruling the church in 1877 forward, he was an older man, as most of the leaders are when they occupy that position. And the ban had been in place already since 1852. So John Taylor argued that Joseph Smith was the originator of the ban, even though there was no revelation that they could find that the prophet, the original founding prophet, had established the ban. But yet they clung to that belief because Joseph Smith was the founding prophet who created or restored, if you will, that's a good Mormon term, restored the theology of the church. And so the expectation was that Joseph Smith would have restored the priesthood ban as well, or at least implemented it, I should say. But
is there any way? Oh, go ahead, Gerardo.
Can we attribute to John Taylor the idea that the ban initiated with Joseph Smith? Because Brigham Young never attributed it to Joseph. Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah. And so John Taylor and his successors, Wilford Woodruff and Joseph F. Smith, those three church presidents who succeeded Brigham Young, they'll go back to Joseph Smith. And what they'll say is, they'll say stuff like, oh, we heard Brigham say that Joseph Smith was the creator of the band. So it's second and third hand. But Gerardo, you're right. There's no direct evidence linking it back to or at least Brigham Young saying in a sermon that it started with Joseph Smith. It's just second and third hand hearsay from other leaders.
So maybe just normal confirmation bias motivated reasoning, not necessarily on John Taylor's part, any attempt to willfully deceive, right?
I don't think so. And I don't think so. But I think a lot of this is just, of course, they're not willing to ask the hard questions. Where's the evidence? Okay, you heard him say it, but does that mean he said it?
Yeah.
And a lot of it's driven by their own racial proclivities at the time.
Right. That makes sense. And I thought it was interesting, the part about Joseph F. Smith declaring Elijah Abel's ordination a mistake. But he can still have it. I thought that was great.
Yeah. And what's extraordinary about Joseph F. Smith saying that his ordination was a mistake was he's already dead. So it's like, what's the point? But I think that
Taylor did say that it was that it was an exception to the rule. Is that right?
People said that. Leaders had said that later on. When it gets out, they'll talk about he's an exception to the rule. And then Joseph Fielding Smith at one point said to a Latter-day Saint inquisitor, there were two Elijah Abels, one white and one black in Nauvoo. It was the white guy that was ordained, not the black one. I mean, they're flummoxed by this, and they're trying to create this coherent theology that just doesn't work because the prophet ordained or had ordained black men during his leadership, and they just didn't know how to make sense of that.
Right.
Part of what's meaningful to me about that is we all observe the apologist dynamic in the modern 21st century of how Mormon apologists try to come up with answers that often don't make sense. And it's interesting to see behind the covers that the church prophets and apostles, that they lead the way behind the scenes in the same types of approaches, right?
Yeah, I think that these are honest brokers. They're doing their very best. They really believe, I think, that Joseph Smith created the band, even though they don't have evidence. And I don't have any evidence to suggest that they were being deceitful or dishonest about it. They knew the truth, but they didn't want to share it. I just, but I'm sure Joseph Fielding Smith knew when he said there were 2 Elijah Abels in Nauvoo. I'm sure he knew that was nonsense. I mean, that's just beyond the pale. But but anyway, and the reason why I'm confident that he knew it was nonsense is because 1, it's just illogical and absurd. But 2, he changes his position months later in another letter to a different Latter-day Saint. He says, yeah, there was an exception to the rule. And so he knew that wasn't a coherent response.
Also, if exceptions are allowed, they could have made a lot of exceptions in the 20th century, in the 21st century, or in the 20th century, right? I mean, that's interesting. Exceptions are allowed?
Well, but so when we get into, I hate to keep saying this, you guys, but when we get into chapter 2, when the church starts to globalize a little bit, this is when they come up close and personal with race construction. They can't tell who's got the blood, who's got the curse. And so they know, they say in their minutes, their private minutes, they know that people of African ancestry are getting ordained to the priesthood. They know it, and they just turn the other way.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Well, what should we touch on next, Matt?
All right. So I think we should move to maybe Joseph Fielding Smith.
Okay. Yeah. I've often said he's one of the most important figures in modern Mormon history, I think. So I'm super excited. Let's do it.
Yeah. So just a background about Joseph Fielding Smith. He comes from Royal Mormon stock, and he's ordained a member of the Council of the 12 Apostles. This is the second highest governing body in the church, second to the first presidency, which is comprised of the prophet and his 2 counselors. And his father is the church president when Joseph Fielding is ordained in 1910 at the age of 32. And you can imagine that the pushback that when the president says, hey, announces in General Conference, which is a semi-annual gathering of Latter-day Saints in Salt Lake, where they have their main theological sermons, that when they announce the new apostle name, that, Joseph Fielding Smith, and the saints, I think Mormons get a bad rap sometimes, that they're just so docile and they just do whatever they're told. And that is just not true. And Mormons are a loud and cantankerous people when they disagree. And anyway, there were some strong rumors afloat that Joseph F. Smith, the church president, this aging patriarch, he is indulging in nepotism. And so they weren't happy. A lot of Latter-day Saints were vocally protesting the nepotism. And I should add, it wasn't just Joseph Fielding Smith. He'd also called one of his other sons into the Quorum of the 12, and I think a nephew as well. So you've got 3 Smiths.
Brigham Young had done something similar, correct?
Brigham Young had done something similar. Other leaders had done something similar. So the gene pool in early church leadership is quite small.
Yeah.
And anyway, so there were charges of nepotism. Joseph F. Smith was warned, if you call your second son into the 12, that there's going to be a pushback. And Joseph F. Smith said, I don't care. And the idea was that the Smiths had an expectation because they had blood, the bloodline that dates back to the prophet Joseph Smith, and also his brother, Hiram Smith, who was murdered in 1844 with Joseph Smith. So those 2 Smith brothers were murdered, the founding prophet and his brother Hiram, who's a close confidant to his brother. And so Joseph Fielding Smith and Joseph F. Smith come through Hiram Smith's bloodline. So they felt that the Smiths had an obligation to run the church. And that's in part why Joseph F. Smith called his 2 sons into the Quorum of the 12, is because the expectation was that they would fulfill Joseph Smith and Hiram Smith's wishes to keep this bloodline going in church leadership. So anyway, prior to Joseph Fielding Smith's call in 1910, he was the assistant church historian, and which meant that he was in charge of curating manuscripts, organizing them, and in some cases, very limited cases, I might add, allowing outsiders, scholars to look at the manuscripts if they were publishing something. Well, in 1910, Joseph Fielding Smith received his second patriarchal blessing. And so he's 32. Sometimes in those days, Latter-day Saints receive two patriarchal blessings. And they don't do that as much today. You usually get one when you're a younger person. If you're born into the church, you might get one during your teenage years. Mine, for example, I think I was 16. And it told me that I would go on a church mission, which I did. It said something about my employment, that I would work with my hands, which is interesting. I'm a college professor. Maybe it means I write books. And anyway, at the time, I thought it meant that I was going to be a chiropractor, which was my yeah. I like chiropractic, and our bishop was a chiropractor, so I had an affinity for that line of work at the time. But anyway, if you're a convert, you might get baptized, and then a year later, you might receive your patriarchal blessing. And in your blessing, as we mentioned in yesterday's episode, that you'd have your lineage declared, and people who were expected to run the church, priesthood holders, so men, they would be usually from the lineage of Ephraim. And if you were black or biracial, you would be from a lineage of Cain or Ham. And so anyway, with the patriarchal blessing, Joseph Fielding Smith received a second one. And in this blessing, it told him that his job would be to preserve the doctrines of the church. And so he sort of anointed himself the preserver of Mormon orthodoxy, of doctrinal orthodoxy. That is, to keep the doctrine pure from maybe radical theologians or radical thinkers who may seek to sully it. And so Joseph Fielding Smith, just to give you a sort of a big line here, he has several different roles he plays in the church once he's ordained in 1910 to the Council of the 12. He's president of the Salt Lake Temple at one point. He's the president of the Salt Lake Genealogical Society at another point. He elevates himself or rises to become president of the Quorum of the 12. And then finally, in 1970, he becomes the LDS Church president, where he serves at the age of 91. He serves for 2 years until he passes at the age of 93. So he has this long and distinguished career in the church, and he's known as being the church's best scriptorian. That is, he could just quote scriptures. They would be in a meeting with the First Presidency and the apostles. They'd be talking about some theological subject, and they would turn to Brother Smith and they would say, "Brother Smith, what scripture supports that?" And then Joseph Fielding could typically just rattle off a scripture from either the Bible, the Book of Mormon, the Doctrine and Covenants, or the Pearl of Great Price. Those are the 4 books of scripture that comprise the Mormon canon. So he really had this grasp of the scriptures, and he was very orthodox and fundamental. If it said that God created the earth in 7 days or 6 days and rested on the seventh, that was what happened. If Adam and Eve were the first people on earth, then there were no such thing as pre-Adamites, as it were. So he had this very literal reading of scripture that would oftentimes conflict with some of his more educated colleagues in the Council of the 12. And Joseph Fielding Smith had what we would say today is the equivalent of a high school education, a GE diploma. He never went to college. And some of the people in the Quorum of the 12 were extremely educated. A guy named John Widtsoe was an apostle, contemporary of Apostle Smith's. And Apostle Widtsoe did his undergraduate degree at Harvard and then did his PhD in chemistry at the University of Nottingham in Germany. Another well-trained Mormon apostle was a guy named James E. Talmage, who did his PhD at Lehigh University in geology. So these are scientific-minded apostles who believed in evolution, for example, thought that evolution was compatible with the gospel. But Joseph Fielding Smith was just anti-evolution. He was reading fundamentalist writers of anti-evolution, and he was always and frequently clashing with some of his better educated, more trained, scientifically trained colleagues. And one of the reasons why I like Joseph Fielding Smith is, here's a guy with a high school diploma telling the PhDs in science that they don't understand evolution. I mean, it's comical. What's not to like about that?
Wow.
and jokes aside, I think he's known in the church because he writes a lot. He's the church's most prolific author in the 20th century. And often his colleagues in the 12, including the church president, they would look to Joseph Fielding Smith to write a book about something. And the books were, today we might say, they're just representative of his fundamentalist mind and how he thinks, right? If the scripture says X, it must mean X. There was no sort of symbology in scripture or metaphor. He just didn't see it that way. But anyway, they would always refer Latter-day Saints to his writings. And so he becomes really quite popular in not just his views on evolution that make its way into church manuals, but also his views on race and lineage. And
really quickly, Matt, can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
So we touched on this last episode, but because it's in the timeline, I want to just touch on it briefly again. Mm-hmm. You talk about a couple things related to Joseph F. and Joseph Fielding that I think are important. One was the fact that both Joseph F. and Joseph Fielding in the early 1900s were trying to find a doctrinal basis for the priesthood ban. And tell me if I'm right, your book says that both of them acknowledged that they could not find a doctrinal basis in terms of like a published revelation or even any type of revelation to justify the priesthood ban. Both Joseph F. and Joseph acknowledged that early in the 20th century, correct?
Yeah. So just to pick up on a thread from yesterday, that by the late 19th century, there's another justification for the priesthood ban that the Brethren create. And it's this idea that Black people were either less valiant or that they were neutral in this premortal war in heaven, in which Jesus and Satan had this war. And one theory said that Black people chose the side of Satan. And as a result, they became cursed. They had limitations because of their choosing Satan, this premortal battle. And those limitations, including being barred from the priesthood, being barred from the temple, and all of that. The other theological part of that was they weren't cursed, or they weren't less neutral. Let me back up. They weren't less valiant. They were actually neutral. They didn't take sides. So you have leaders that were positing those two different theological positions, but they were both based on the Pearl of Great Price, a book within that book of scripture called the Book of Abraham. And
tell me if I'm right, that it's, at one point, B.H. Roberts, historian B.H. Roberts, kind of represented the not valiant side. And Mormon prophet Wilford Woodruff represented the neutral side. And then Joseph F. and Joseph Fielding were trying to navigate that. Is that right?
Yeah. So there were two competing positions in the 1880s. One was from an article that B.H. Roberts, who's like Joseph Fielding Smith, a self-made person, didn't have formal training, and B.H. Roberts became this very prominent general authority. So he wrote a piece that was published in a church magazine in 1886, and he argued that Black people were less valiant in the preexistence, whereas the church president Wilford Woodruff argued that they were astride the fence, they were neutral. And Joseph F. Smith and his son Joseph Fielding Smith, they argued that the neutral position was nonsense. There was no scriptural justification for it. And as these two theories are playing out in church publications, Latter-day Saints are writing into the Brethren. They're saying, all right, are Black people neutral? Are they less valiant? What's going on here? And did the ban start with Joseph Smith? When did it start? And so Joseph F. Smith and his counselors, they lead this concerted effort to look into some of the church records to see if there was a revelation. Did it start with Joseph Smith? And this had been ongoing for a number of years at this point, because they tried to do that with Elijah Abel too, about 15 years earlier, when they were talking about his ordination, if it was valid. And so they couldn't find a revelation at all from the prophet. And so,
Gerardo thinks it might be a good idea for me to read from your book. Is that okay if I do that really quick?
Oh, please.
Okay. So this is page 15, two paragraphs down. I'm just going to read a little bit. It says, in 1907, 3 years before he was called as church apostle, this is Joseph Fielding Smith, expressed discomfort. I believe it's Joseph Fielding, right?
Yes.
Joseph Fielding Smith expressed discomfort with the rationales justifying the priesthood and temple ban. So he's uncomfortable. Before he's an apostle, he's uncomfortable with the rationales. He had heard them his entire life from his father, Joseph F., and other church leaders, and knew that there wasn't a written revelation affirming the ban, which is why he initially believed that it was more a tradition than a fixed doctrine. Quote, and this is so that it says, tradition states that the prophet, okay, this is Joseph Fielding Smith writing now, right? Quote,
Yeah.
Tradition states that the prophet Joseph Smith declared that the reason why the children of Cain cannot receive the priesthood is that Cain cut his brother Abel off from the earth before he had seed. Close quote. Smith speculated in a letter to a concerned member, and that's one of the beautiful things about your book. You've got these amazing letters that none of us knew existed. So Joseph Fielding Smith speculated in a letter to a concerned member. But then Smith went on to denounce other rationales for the ban, namely that Black people had been, quote, neutral in the war in heaven. This position lacked scriptural support, Smith asserted, echoing his father. He called this teaching, quote, the opinion of early leaders. Gerardo, tell us why you think that's so important.
Well, I mean, this show. I mean, just the next line and the next paragraph it says, by 1924, some 15 years later, he had decidedly cast a new tone, and so it just shows that he knew it didn't existed. He felt wrong, that it was wrong.
Yeah, you're right. Let me read it. In the church's magazine, The Improvement Era, the precocious apostle. So this is, 17 years later? Is that right?
Yeah, he's in his early 40s at this point.
Mm-hmm.
So now all of a sudden he's changed his tune. In the church's magazine, The Improvement Era, the precocious apostle wrote that Mormon racial teachings were, quote, doctrine, close quote, that Joseph Smith Jr. taught them as doctrine. That's a problem. And that under no circumstances could Black members hold the priesthood. Sorry, Gerardo, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Oh, no, that's great. That's great.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know. That's just pretty significant because it just comes to what we're talking about, right? They knew from the beginning that this was problematic, but they would try to come up with rationales to come to church concerning church members. Is that right, Matt?
Yeah, it's unsettled, right? It's I have to tell people that the priesthood ban, it's a lot of things. It's a practice, it's a policy, and it's a doctrine, all rolled into one. And at this point, it had been a practice, but really not an established doctrine. It's just they have different theories about the ban. Some people, the Black people are cursed, some they're neutral, some they're less valiant. So they're all over the place. And one of the things that frequently catches my attention when I see some church publications that kind of drive me nuts a little bit, to be honest, is that I've seen this 1907 letter quoted by the church once in a while, and they focus on the idea that the rationales for the ban are opinions or traditions, as Joseph Fielding Smith says in 1907. And the reason why some church publications say that, and the reason why I'm a little unnerved by that, is because the message would be that it was never doctrine, that were just, some opinions that a few people taught. And the problem with that line of thinking is, number one, this is in 1907, Joseph Fielding Smith wasn't even an apostle yet. So he's the assistant church historian just writing his private opinion to a private member. And number two, when people use that 1907 letter, the idea of a tradition or an opinion, to make this idea that it was never doctrine, they forget what he writes later, where he writes books called Doctrines of Salvation, in which he talks about the ban. So later on, it becomes a doctrine, and he's clear about that. But yet, unfortunately, some people who write this in church manuals, they don't understand that, and they just fixate on the opinion part because they don't want to link it to a doctrine.
Well, I didn't know that this is the letter where this idea of it being folklore or an opinion comes from.
And the idea would be that Elder Packer, the late apostle who died in 2015, he said something that some Latter-day Saints, including my own father, quotes often, which is that doctrines never change. And I've talked to my dad about this, who's a very good bishop in the church and just a good Latter-day Saint man. And anyway, I said, Dad, that's not accepted by all the leaders, of course. That was Elder Packer's view, but not all leaders believe that. Doctrines do change. And we talked about the priesthood ban being one of them. It was definitely a doctrine. It became a doctrine by 1949 that we'll get to, but it became a doctrine. And certainly that changed. And I told my dad, I said, the beauty of the church and its teachings is they believe in modern day revelation. So what could be a doctrine in one generation doesn't necessarily have to be a doctrine in another generation if the prophet receives a revelation to make that change. And so that's not a jarring thing to think about, but that's why they downplay the priesthood ban as doctrine, is because of Elder Packard's influence, suggesting that doctrines never change.
Right.
All right. So is it time to talk about this amazing book that I ordered over the weekend? It's called The Way to Perfection by Joseph Fielding Smith. And I'll just say, before there was Mormon doctrine and before there was Doctrines of Salvation, volume 1, 2, and 3, there was The Way to Perfection by Joseph Fielding Smith. For me, this is the original Mormon doctrine, but take it away, Matt Harris.
Yeah, no, there's no doubt about it. I think most people, for your audience members who may not know some best-selling LDS books, one of the most prominent books in the LDS Church is a book called Mormon Doctrine. It was written by Joseph Fielding Smith's son-in-law, a guy named Bruce R. McConkie. It was published in 1958, and it was removed from print in 2010. So Mormon Doctrine had a long history. But the book before that members used, and that was the most influential book in the 20th century, even more than Mormon Doctrine, was a book called The Way to Perfection by Joseph Fielding Smith. And it was published in 1931. It went through at least, I think, 15 reprint editions. Wow. And it was finally pulled from print at Desert Book, which is a church publishing house, LDS Church publishing house. It was taken out of print in 1989, 1990. So when it was taken out of print in 1989, 1990, it was still selling copies. And I can tell you, if my book is still selling copies decades after I'm dead, I think my children will be happy. But anyway, so it's a best-selling book.
You're kind of implying that maybe he made quite a bit of money off this book, right?
He did. I mean, whenever you're selling books over decades, you're going to make money. And when Joseph Fielding Smith's son and a Mormon journalist named John J. Stewart, they had partnered together in, I think, 1972 to write a short book on Joseph Fielding Smith, who just had passed, or maybe he was still the president and then died that year. I can't remember if the book came out after he died or not. But anyway, so they wrote a book about him. And in that book, in fact, it's right behind on my shelf somewhere. But in that book, they talk about the royalties that Joseph Fielding Smith receives, and they're quite lucrative. And they don't give dollar amounts, but I mean, he's making money because the saints are buying this book. And what's extraordinary about this book, before we get into the details of it, is that the church, they ask him to write it.
The first presidency, right?
First presidency asks him to write it.
Yeah.
And it really is a commentary, I think, on two things. One is the church is really interested in lineage and these pure bloodlines. And that's why they supported Susa Young Gates's book. And that's why they support this book, is that it's an idea to sort of a more concerted look at where people come from and how they fit into this idea of extended kinships and how people relate to one another. And as part of that book, of course, Joseph Fielding Smith has to deal with Black people and biracial people. And so it's also Joseph Fielding Smith's attempt to systematize the church's race theology. We have all these different theories circulating in Mormon public spheres at this point. And so Joseph Fielding Smith certainly has his views. He argues that Black people are less valiant. He argues that they're cursed, all of that stuff. And some of his contemporaries don't agree with this. But this is his way to make his voice felt in the church. So he writes this book, and he creates this theology that Black people are denied certain privileges because of this cursing, and it prevents them from going to the temple. It prevents them from fully participating in the church. And I think what's most instructive from this discussion today about this book is that Joseph Fielding Smith is really the first popular Mormon writer to emphasize this idea that Negroes, as he puts it, are from a less favored lineage. We talked about a racialized hierarchy a minute ago. This is what that means, that they're not one of the chosen lineages or the favored lineages, which would be white people. They're at the very bottom of this racialized hierarchy, or as he puts it, a less favored lineage. And he also quotes Brigham Young, and he says that anybody with one drop of African ancestry would be denied the priesthood. And then he says something that's really, really controversial, that even the most radical Mormon thinkers at the time wouldn't even accept. And that is that Black people have inferior bodies, that they are inferior to white people. Some of the chosen lineage stuff, that's just sort of implied, but he just, lest there be any ambiguity, he clearly states that Black people have inferior bodies and that they're inferior to white people. And there's a lot of church leaders. I have to, when I talk publicly about these kinds of things, I think a lot of Latter-day Saints are always, and also non-Latter-day Saints, they tend to think that if one Mormon leader believes, X about Black people, they all believe that. And that's just simply not the case. There are some church leaders who do not believe that Black people are cursed, but they think they're less valiant. And there are some church leaders, including Spencer W. Kimball, the president who will later lift the ban decades later. I mean, one can imagine him thinking and saying that Black people were inferior to white people. He may believe that, but to say that, to articulate that publicly, is another whole animal. So that's what he does. And this becomes the standard text on
Matt, can I just read this one sentence in the book?
Yeah.
He said, you say, but Smith didn't stop there, and you're talking about way to perfection. You say he claimed that Black people were an inferior race, forever doomed to be the servants of God's covenant people. So not just inferior, but also, meant to be serving the white people. Is that
Thank
right?
you, Gerardo. Thank you for that. Yeah, that's an important detail.
Basically, celestial slavery, right?
Yeah. So what he's doing is he's following Brigham Young on this, and who's following 19th century Southern slaveholders, and they interpret the Bible to mean that there were two kinds of biblical figures where the curse derives. One would be Cain, who slew his brother Abel, and the second one was Ham, who made fun of his father Noah, the prophet figure Noah, for being drunk. And there's one account that says that Ham was poking his father's genitals, naked body genitals, with a prod, a stick, if you will, and just making fun of his father for being drunk. And so God showed his displeasure by cursing Ham, and also Ham's son Canaan and his posterity. And as part of this curse, Ham's son and his posterity, Canaan, would be servants to non-cursed peoples. And this, of course, is one of the ways in which Southern slaveholders derive biblical justification for slavery. And so when Joseph Fielding Smith and Brigham Young are talking about Black people being servants to white people, that's what they mean. They're doing it through that racialized biblical framework. But this is really jarring because, I mean, this is the 1930s, and to argue that Black people be, celestial servants to white people, that's not going to go over very well, particularly in the 1950s and 60s when the civil rights movement heats up.
Or 1980s, which the book was selling up until 1980s.
Or the 1980s. Holy cow. I should say something that you guys, your listeners, will find interesting. So this book is being sold everywhere. It's the church asked them to write it. They're studying it at church. It became the basis for Sunday school lessons. So they're studying one of the lesson manuals. They give the lesson about the curse of Cain and all that stuff. And then they have study questions that they would typically prompt Latter-day Saint teachers to ask their students. So these would be teenage, the LDS youth and teenage classes, and also adults. And one of the questions they would ask is, comment that Negroes that are inferior to white people, and they should be servants in the hereafter. So they're trying to generate discussion about Black people being servants to white people.
Wow.
And I can't imagine how, LDS youth, what'd you learn today? Well, let me tell you, Mom and Dad. But anyway, so it was really ingrained into the church. And
can I read one more passage from the book?
Yeah.
I just really want to drive it home. So again, this is the way to perfection. This was printed in 1970, so it's 14th printing, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I just have to read this. This is on page 43. And again, think about this as a book commissioned by the Mormon Church First Presidency, written by an apostle, the son of the prophet Joseph F. Smith, right?
And used in Sunday school. Used
Yeah, used church-wide, in Sunday school, okay, for a long time. That the Negro race, for instance, have been placed under restrictions because of their attitude in the world of spirits, few will doubt. It cannot be looked upon as just that they should be deprived of the power of the priesthood without it being a punishment for some act or acts performed before they were born. So he's saying, hey, if they don't have the priesthood now, they must have been bad in the pre-earth life. Reason, that's the only conclusion we could arrive at with reason. Not that the band is wrong, but that they must have done something bad in the pre-earth life. He goes on to say, yet, like all other spirits who come into this world, they come innocent before God so far as mortal existence is concerned. And here, under certain restrictions, they may work out their second estate. Goes on, if they prove faithful in this estate, without doubt, our eternal Father, who is just and true, will reward them accordingly, and there will be in store for them some blessings of exaltation. Can somebody tell me what some blessings of exaltation means exactly? It's not like full exaltation, all the blessings that it's like, if they're really good in this life, they may get some of it. I'm sorry, I'm acting a little bit sarcastic, but like it, later the church is going to issue a very controversial gospel topics essay, which is something you've covered on Mormon Stories, where they're going to basically just say all the, opinions of the past were folklore and they were just the opinions of the leaders. No, this is books commissioned by First Presidency members, written by apostles and sons of prophets, established as curriculum and used for half a century in the church. That's not just little rumors and opinions of some men. Matt, did I get any of that right?
I mean, you're capturing the gravity of it. This is not an ordinary book. Like you said, it was, and like I write, this is commissioned by the church. It's a high-ranking person. And what's even most important is that when people, Latter-day Saints, they've been taught that Black people are neutral, they're less valiant, all that stuff. When they write the Brethren in Salt Lake asking for clarification, they recommend The Way to Perfection. I was shocked at how this book was used by the Brethren. There was only one person that did not recommend that book, and we'll talk about David O. McKay later, but most of them were always saying, hey, you got a question about the priesthood ban, look at Brother Smith's book. And they would encourage them to read it. And one of the things I want to just quickly say is that as this book is going through multiple reprint editions, as it's being translated into multiple languages to be used in the church around the world, that obviously it's offensive if you're trying to get into countries of color like South Africa or Brazil in particular. And years ago, I was at BYU and doing some research, and I had a meeting with one of the church's foremost Latin American experts, a wonderful man named Mark Grover, who's done some really incredible work on the church in Brazil, where I believe he was a missionary. And anyway, so I met with Mark one day and I said, Mark, how did the Brazil saints, how did they deal with The Way to Perfection? I mean, this is chapters 15 and 16 were the two chapters where he really articulates some of the most heavy racist thinking of all this. And Mark looked at me and he said, well, I looked at the Portuguese editions and they took them out. Chapters 15 and 16 weren't there.
Whoa.
And so they recognize it's offensive. I didn't have any reason to doubt Mark. I believe him. And
that's a huge deal.
It is a huge deal. And I confirm that what Mark told me. I have a friend who served his mission in Brazil. And so he's still fluent in Portuguese. And so anyway, I had the friend meet me at the BYU library after I met with Mark. And I said, hey, I have reason to believe they took chapters 15 and 16 out. Let's pull some of the Portuguese editions of The Way to Perfection. And, I don't speak Portuguese, so it won't matter to me, but can you help me out? And so we pulled several editions in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. And all of the editions that we pulled, my friend looked through, and 15 and 16 were missing.
That's crazy.
And
I have one more point. I'm sorry. I think this is really important because these are other points that he makes in the book that are really, really important to drive home. I think he said, furthermore, and this is in Weight of Perfection, Smith noted that the curse would be lifted in the future after the seed of Adam, white people, and non-cursed lineages had the chance to receive the priesthood first. So he gave a date of when the I mean, it's unspecified, but he said, all the white people had to receive it first, which was not, of course, 1970.
Right. Yeah.
1970. And then he said, in God's due time, he wrote, black skin would revert back to its primitive state of whiteness, making black people eligible for all of the church's salvific ordinances. So he also mentioned, and then you said he meant this in a literal, physical way. I'm glad you included that sentence there. But why did you include it there, Matt?
Well, because there's a growing body in the church who argue that the curses in Scripture represent something metaphorical, your sinful nature, for example, not your skin color, but your sinful nature. And I think that's true. I think that you can read responsibly into the Scriptures that some of these curses could be metaphorical and refer to your, I don't like these racialized metaphors anyway, but could refer to the darkness of your soul, let's say, which could refer to sin or something. But it also means in a very literal way that you have a change in phenotype if you repent of your sins. And the idea would be that we're all white. The universal human family is white. Some of us made poor decisions. We sinned. God cursed us with black and brown skin. And if we were to abide his presence again, we would have to be purged of that curse. And so Joseph Fielding Smith is caught up in this racialized language. It didn't start with Latter-day Saints. This is something that predates. I just finished another big essay on this. But Protestant Christians in particular had been teaching a literal change in skin when they embraced Jesus's love and utilized his atonement to repent of their sins. And Mormons are swept up in this as well. And so Joseph Fielding Smith believes this in a very literal way. And he won't talk about this in public a lot because he knows this is controversial. But in private, in particular, talking to church leaders and church educators, he'll talk about examples that he knows of where Negroes, their skin color actually changes when they embrace the gospel of Jesus Christ, which is Mormonism. So he believes this stuff. Not all Latter-day Saint apostles will be teaching this, but definitely Joseph Fielding is, because he's certainly one of the more radical thinkers with racial theology. And he's also, as we're finding out, one of the most significant, because people are buying his book. They're structuring, they're patterning it after LDS lessons. And I wanted to share one reading, if I don't mind, about this book. And this is like the influence of this book. And so on page 20, I talk about how the book was translated from English into German, Dutch, French, Portuguese, Danish, Finnish, and Japanese, and other languages. But also, I came across, one of my good friends had alerted me to a book by this Nigerian-American author named Tope Fullerin. And it was published in 2019. So this young man he's probably, I don't know, in his 30s today, maybe. But he's not a Latter-day Saint. He's probably older than that, actually. But anyway, he wrote this book called A Particular Kind of Black Man. And my friend called attention to this great passage where Tope Fullerin, this Nigerian-American author, had lived in Utah as a young man. This is on page 20 of my book. I'm going to read it. It says that in his novel, A Particular Kind of Black Man, Fullerin recounted how a white Mormon neighbor walked him to school each day and told him that he'd be a servant to her in the next life if he behaved properly. And then here's the exact quote. Fullerin writes, "She would often pat my head as we walked together, and a penetrating silence would cancel the morning sounds around us. I felt comfortable, protected somehow in her presence. Her parting words were always the same. Remember, if you were a good boy here on earth, you can serve me in heaven. I was 5 years old. Her words sounded magical to me, vast and alluring." And he's quoting from, he doesn't know this, of course, but the neighbor that walked into school and patted his head, this 5-year-old kid walking to school. She's learning this from Joseph Fielding Smith. And it really just speaks, this is 1989, folks. And this just speaks to
the legacy,
the staying power of this book.
And I'll just, because you mention it, I'll jump back really quickly to page 17, because a lot of those who are really trying to understand how the sausage is made, how church leadership works, they just want to know, what did people know? When did they know it? Were there ever instances where there were cover-ups? And of course, Joseph Fielding Smith, sort of in some of the circles I run in, is most notorious for ripping out the 1932 version of Joseph Smith's first vision from a specific journal and hiding it once the 1838 account of Joseph Smith's first vision became the official version. So there are some people that feel like Joseph Fielding Smith either had an honesty problem or intentionally hid or misled people. And I'm not coming down on that one way or the other than to point out that on page 17 of your book, you note at least two really important things or omissions. One is that, or reversals. You note that Joseph Fielding Smith, we just read how a couple decades ago, Joseph Fielding Smith acknowledges in a private letter that there was no real written revelation or doctrinal basis for the priesthood ban. You say that Smith's claim that the priesthood restriction began with Joseph Smith was audacious, given that there wasn't a definitive revelation linking the ban to his uncle. So we know that he knew there wasn't a definitive revelation, and yet he neglected to say that in the book and instead just doubled down and reversed on saying it was a revelation. But even a little bit more disturbing is we know that Joseph Fielding Smith knew about Elijah Abel and presumably other black men receiving the priesthood during Joseph Smith's day. And it has to have been that he intentionally left out that information from the way to perfection, because it's inconvenient to tell the truth, which is that Joseph Smith ordained likely at least 5 black men to the priesthood. And that's important because, he left that out, and he knowingly left that out.
Yeah, did he know about the other men ordained? It's hard to know. I mean, one could argue that, hey, this is a church historian. Of course he should know. But the truth is there are, tens of thousands or millions of records in the church archives. And unless you're looking for something in particular, he may not have known that. But the evidence that I have is he certainly knew about Elijah Abel because of his father's experiences with Elijah Abel, because of what Andrew Jensen had written, because of what other Latter-day Saints had written asking about Elijah Abel. So Abel was certainly on his mind, but did he know about Q. Walker Lewis or Joseph Ball, or maybe if William McCary held the priesthood, the part Native American, African American, did he know about those characters? I mean, we don't know. It's not evidence for it.
Okay.
But he left out Elijah Abel in the way to perfection. And I mean, why would he put Abel in there? It would just cause more grief for him. It would raise more questions to the saints. And so he left him out.
Well, I guess if he were really, really committed to full truth and honesty, he would include it, right?
Well, I mean, it's true. I mean, it's just, I think the brethren, they're dealing with race issues. They've never dealt with them before. And this is going to be, moved to another whole level when we get to the next chapter and talk about when the church starts to globalize. And this is when you get huge issues from Brazil, South Africa, but they're also dealing with this a little bit at home too, in the southern states, where you get biracial relationships and they have no idea what to do because, again, they can't really figure out who's got the so-called curse and who doesn't. So Joseph Fielding Smith is trying to make sense, just to recap, he's trying to make sense of these various theories circulating in church literature. And his book is a way to sort of set it all straight. And he wants to figure out how Black people fit into this grand cosmology. So he talks about how they became cursed. And Gerardo, as you mentioned, I think a minute ago, or John, you read a passage, one of you, I guess, but how they became cursed and how they will be redeemed from that curse if they follow God's commandments. So he's trying to help people understand where Black people fit into this grand scheme. And I should say that, for me, I don't know, I guess cover-up's an interesting word, but for me, it's he's just sort of muddling along as it goes. And you mentioned, John, a minute ago, you read a passage about limited blessings of exaltation, I think is how you worded it, from his book. And so he wrote that in 1931, that there'd be limited blessings of exaltation. And in 1939, Joseph Fielding Smith writes, a member of the First Presidency, a guy named Reuben Clark, and he tells Reuben Clark, he said that the Negro cannot receive the blessings of exaltation because they don't have the priesthood. And that's really a startling claim, because in Mormon theology, exaltation is like, for your audience who may not know how Mormons think about the afterlife, exaltation would be the highest degree of glory in the celestial kingdom, one of the highest degrees of glory or power that Mormons can offer. And in order to be exalted, there's a couple of things that have to happen. One, you have to be married and sealed in the temple. And if you're a man, you have to have the priesthood. And so that was the context by which Smith wrote Clark and said, look, they can't be exalted because they don't have the priesthood. And they can't enjoy the sealing power, that important ritual in Mormon temples, without the priesthood. And so in a very real way, they couldn't be exalted because they lack those privileges.
Yeah. I mean, there's this idea of the memory hole, that things get forgotten. And I just think this is how things get forgotten. When you publish a seminal work, First Presidency directs a seminal work like this to get published, and certain really important factors get left out, then they go down the memory hole, and you wait 1 or 2 generations and pretty much everyone's forgotten. And I think that's what happened with a lot of issues, including the Peepstone in the Hat with the Book of Mormon translation, Joseph Smith's polygamy. There's so much that modern Mormons don't know about their history. And everybody's like, non-Mormons are like, how did you not know Joseph Smith was a polygamist? Or how did you not hear about the Peepstone in the Hat? It's because when curriculum gets written, important things are left out, and then it goes down the memory hole.
Right.
Well, that's why historians like me keep it alive, right?
Is it worth mentioning? I want to get to some of the important ways that some of these issues are portrayed in church magazines like the Improvement Era. But before we do, I think it's worth noting that at least 2 apostles disagree pretty significantly with some of what's written in the Way to Perfection. Do you want to just note that? Because sometimes we think as Mormons that all the apostles are in agreement, which is obviously silly, but some disagreed with it, right?
Yeah, the apostle that I referenced earlier, one of the scientifically trained apostles, John Widtsoe, the guy who was a chemist, he was the president of Utah Logan, or Utah Agricultural College at the time, and now it's called Utah State University in northern Utah. But so he was a college president before he became a member of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, and really a sort of a gentlemanly guy. He was just very likable, very cerebral, had a huge library, was always reading. He was an academic, he was an intellectual. And so even though he had great respect for Joseph Fielding Smith, and even though he called The Way to Perfection, quote, a fine piece of work when it came out, he utterly rejected his views on race and lineage. And John Widtsoe had been struggling himself with race and lineage for a long time. He told, I'll just read on page 21, a little quote that he said, that he told a friend in 1947, quote, the Negro problem within the church is a puzzling one to me. He fussed, this is what I write, he fussed at and this is Widtsoe, the old idea that Negroes were neutral in heaven is not supported by anything in the scriptures. And when John Widtsoe in the mid 1920s was asked to compile and edit and publish some snippets from the discourses of Brigham Young, he had included a section in there on there would be a time in the future, Brigham Young wrote, that Black people would receive the priesthood. And the church president, Heber J. Grant, asked him to take it out, didn't want it in the published version, because Grant wrote in his diary that it would cause, quote, a great deal of discussion among Latter-day Saints if Widtsoe kept that in. And so they were uneasy about being pinned down to the time when the ban would be lifted and that Black people could experience the full privileges of the church. Widtsoe was also a person that didn't like this whole one drop stuff. He thought it was nuts. And in a quorum meeting one day, Widtsoe recommended that a sister, quote, having 1/32 of Negro blood in her veins be permitted to marry in the temple. And of course, this violates the one drop rule that the church had followed. And of course, he got voted down on it. But he just didn't like the church's racial theology. And what I found was really interesting, I'm going to say something controversial, and I don't mean to be offensive. So please, I hope no one takes this as offensive. But as Elder Widtsoe is working through the church, and he's trying to be loyal to the church's teachings on race, but he has some, serious issues with it, that he writes this book called Gospel Interpretations. And this is 1940, late 40s, just after the Second World War had ended. And he criticizes Adolf Hitler, this idea that there's a master race. And Widtsoe just doesn't find any scriptural support for any of this stuff, and doesn't think that the scriptures privilege any sort of group or certain race of people. He calls that sheer poppycock. And of course, this is really in violation of what Joseph Fielding Smith is teaching, that God does favor certain groups of people, certain races and lineages. And so the Brethren called Anglo-Saxons God's favored lineage. This is Joseph Fielding Smith and others. And of course, Hitler called them the master race. So there are these ideas of racial superiority that are swirling about in world history at the time. And Joseph Fielding, of course, is imbibing in these. And then people like Widtsoe are pushing back. The second person I'll just briefly mention is somebody that we're going to develop at great length in later episodes. But the Apostle David O. McKay, who would later become a church president. And McKay was, and I'll describe him in more detail, his personality later, but McKay was really, really uneasy about the ban. And he never once, in thousands of pages of his diaries, his private correspondence that exist, I've seen hundreds of these pages. And I've worked closely over the years with his biographer, a guy named Gregory Prince, who did a wonderful book in 2005 on President McKay or Elder McKay. So Greg has shared just a lot of material with me over the years, and I've seen materials in other archives about McKay. And anyway, I asked Greg Prince once, I said, Greg, I haven't seen any indication that David O. McKay thought that Black people were cursed and that he supported Joseph Fielding Smith's book. And Greg wrote back and he said, I've never seen any indication either in which McKay talked about Black people deriving from the curse of Cain or the curse of Ham. But McKay did believe that there was something about the premortal existence that limited their ability to hold the priesthood and to attend the temple. And so he believed in the one teaching, but not the other. And so both of these two apostles had a lot of weight at the time, but clearly they were in the minority, and they just quietly went along with the church's race teachings. And when David O. McKay became the church president in 1951, he starts to push back quietly and subtly on some of these teachings.
Yeah.
Part of why I think this is really interesting is because the idea of, like, let's just say today, just to kind of think about a modern issue, like there are rumors I've heard that not all the members of the Quorum of the 12 or the First Presidency agree on how the church today is dealing with the LGBTQ members. Let's say that there's some like Boyd K. Packer in the past or Donald H. Oaks now who feel one way, but maybe some of the more progressive apostles like Christofferson or Holland or whoever are, disagree. It's unthinkable in 2024 to have apostles publishing, in the Ensign or their own books where they're publicly disagreeing. And I've talked to older, members of the church who really loved that about the culture of the church in the 30s, 40s, 50s, that apostles actually could publicly disagree. And that's just a phenomenon that I think is unthinkable for a modern Mormon that happened. And I'm trying to just imagine what it was like for the membership to have Widtsoe disagreeing with Joseph Fielding Smith. And as I understand it, Eyring and Talmage and Widtsoe all disagreed with Joseph Fielding Smith about evolution as well, publicly. And it's something that used to happen that seems like that would be a healthy thing that now is heavily discouraged and would be less common. And I think maybe that's unfortunate in my opinion.
I do too. I mean, we talked yesterday about Orson Pratt, the outspoken intellectual apostle, publicly opposing multiple teachings of the church president, Brigham Young. And I mean, from Adam God to this idea that God progresses in knowledge, to the idea that Black people were cursed, to the idea that black people shouldn't be able to vote. I mean, you just wouldn't see this today. And the difference between Orson Pratt and Brigham Young and, say, Talmage and Widsoe and Joseph Fielding Smith and also maybe others is that Orson Pratt, in my reading, I mean, he didn't try to be respectful. He's just like, he's wrong, you know? And where the apostles in the 20th century, as you point out, John, they were more respectful in how they couched their differences. Today, I think one can imagine that Quentin L. Cook of the Quorum of the 12, who was the stake president in Northern California, and I'm told from people that I've met or known that of people who were in his stake when he was the stake president, I mean, they would frequently talk to him about, you know, they would say, you know, President Cook, I'm gay and the church doesn't seem to have a place for me, you know, and one can imagine that he would be unsympathetic to that kind of pastoral care. And I don't have any proof for this, but in my sense that he would bring those kinds of attitudes into the Quorum of the 12. Todd Christofferson, whose brother, and the church has talked about this, his brother's gay, and Elder Christofferson, I'm certain, would have affection for his brother, and well, I know he has affection for his brother, but it would be sensitive to the struggle of, you know, remaining in the church and identifying as gay.
Yeah. Well, that's just part of why this book is so fascinating. All right, so let's jump back to a really, really important part of your book, and I'm going to just warn people, this for sure is going to be one of the most offensive things that they read from your book or hear about on this podcast. And it's basically the way that Black people were characterized in some of the church's publications. So we're talking about page 18 now, the bottom paragraph, and we actually have some visuals that are very shocking. They use the N-word, and they're incredibly offensive, but it would not be, I think it would be a disservice to ignore it. So Matt, take us through that if you're comfortable.
Yeah, so as a historian, of course, one of the things that I always try to point out is who influences the church, what influences them, what did they know, when did they know it, what did their teachings say, what impact did it have on members, and also that Latter-day Saints, it's true today and was certainly true then, we're all products of our environment, right? We're influenced by cultural and political trends. And when Joseph Fielding Smith published The Way to Perfection in 1931, I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on with race in the world. And I thought that it was really important to talk about in my book briefly, not at length, but just briefly about some of the cultural context. And just give you a few examples about this is that there are Protestant ministers who are members of the Ku Klux Klan, and somehow they read the Bible into supporting white hegemony. They thought that that was okay. There were ministers that were involved in eugenics, trying to sterilize Black people from procreating. There were American history textbooks that glorified white supremacy. And these are textbooks across the United States that school children and high school students are studying. There are two best-selling books in the 1920s that glorify white supremacy. And really, some of the language that you see today, that, you know, brown and Black people, particularly brown people, immigrants coming across the border, they're taking over the country. This is the sort of thing they're talking about in the 1920s with immigration laws, that brown people are going to replace white people. So all of this irrational fear. And so people are reading this stuff. This is also the time when Hitler's Nuremberg laws that proved lethal to Jews are about. This is a time when people are framing Blackness in American magazines by talking about, you know, Black children walking around without shoes, portraying like that they're uncivilized, or Black people gorging themselves on watermelon, or the happy slave, Aunt Jemima. Some of you eat pancakes or waffles and you pour Aunt Jemima syrup on. This is the happy slave who was content to be a slave. These are all racialized tropes. And Latter-day Saints will participate in this racist discourse. And disturbingly, in the 1920s and 30s, and even into the 1950s and 60s, Latter-day Saints will publish some of these racist stereotypes of Black people. And one of the ones that I found the most disturbing was, I'm not even going to say the N-word, I don't like using that word, but it's called The Little N Baby. And it's a poem that the church published in the Juvenile Instructor, one of the official church magazines, and you can see it here. This is on page 44. I quote part of this poem in my book. It's called Little N Baby, and it was by a man named Frank Steele, and talking about the little baby with curly, kinky hair. And so this was just standard.
Can I read it? Is that all right if I read it? Just a little bit?
Sure.
All right, so this is on the screen. Little N-word baby with your curly, kinky hair and a pair of eyes, a looking sad and deep, two tiny hands, a clenching at your mammy's loving breast, and she rocks her little sugar babe to sleep. Little N-word baby, just arrived from heaven above. My heart is full of tenderness for you. Beneath that dusky skin, a guileless heart, I see a lovin' just like white folks babies do. Little N-word baby, rest on your mammy's breast, and angels will watch over you while you sleep. And it goes on and on. Now, really quickly, to really drive this point home, where was this poem published and on what date?
It was published in 1924. I don't know Frank Steele, the author. I assume he's LDS. One would assume that because it was published in a church-sponsored publication. But it's possible.
Juvenile Instructor, right?
Juvenile Instructor. And just for...
What was that book?
What's that?
What is the Juvenile Instructor, for those who don't know?
The Juvenile Instructor was one of the church's main periodicals of the day. There were really two or three, depending on where you're at. If you were overseas, there would be a different periodical that Latter-day Saints would publish called Latter-day Saint Messenger. But in the United States, there were two main periodicals. One was called the Juvenile Instructor, which is where this poem was published. And the other one was called the Improvement Era. And later on, I think the Juvenile Instructor, I don't remember how long that run lasted. I mean, decades for sure. The Improvement Era ended in 1970, and it gave way to the Ensign, which was just discontinued a couple of years ago and called something else now. But so the Juvenile Instructor was the main periodical that Latter-day Saints would read. And this is the stuff they're reading. And the reason why I put this in the book is because I wanted the readers to know that Latter-day Saints, as a historian, I'm always interested in context. And Latter-day Saints they're imbibing in these larger cultural milieus that talk about race and denigrating and degrading Black people like it's just common, it's accepted. And so Latter-day Saints are putting these racist caricatures of Black people and talking about Black people in unflattering terms in their own periodicals, much as you would see in secular magazines and periodicals in the United States. And so Joseph Fielding Smith is he's part of this culture. This is what he's reading as an apostle. This is what he and his colleagues are approving for publication. Sometimes in General Conference, they would use the N-word. Heber J. Grant, a church president, when he was the apostle, he would tell ribald jokes over the pulpit in General Conference using the N-word. So it was just, it was standard fare of the day. The church leaders today would never, ever do, this sort of thing. But in those days, because much of the nation was racist and because much of the nation got away with this, it was just something that nobody questioned. And Joseph Fielding Smith wrote this book in this era when people were using this sort of language.
Yeah. And should we go ahead and then also just show the other photo from an article? Maybe tell us what publication this was and around what date, and then we'll show the image and describe it.
Yeah, there's another image. So there were dozens of images. I didn't, I only talked about one or two in my book. I talk about that Mormon publications routinely referred to Black people. This is early 20th century, 1920s and 30s. But Mormon publications referred to Black people routinely as darkies, N-word, and coons. And when I did my research, I was just astonished, frankly, at the number of examples I found of using language like this. And I also found that Latter-day Saints would, much like other people in the United States, so this is not unique to Mormons, I want to be very clear on this, that Mormons would put on what's called blackface, that white people would put chalk or charcoal on their faces to pretend that they were Black. And they would oftentimes use blackface and put on what are called minstrel shows, where they would put on dancing shows and white people pretending they're Black, dancing around, essentially making a fool of themselves. The audience, most of whom are white, would be laughing, and they would pay money to go to these shows to watch Black Mormons or white Mormons in blackface dancing around. So it was a form of entertainment that Americans at large had done ever since the 19th century. And Mormons are following this practice. And in this image, John, that you'll show here, it's a picture of blackface from, I think this was from the Latter-day Saint Messenger in Portsmouth, England. And you can see that there are 3 Latter-day Saints here in blackface.
I'll read the caption. So this is, for those who are just listening, it looks like a roadshow, but it's basically 3 people dressed in what looks like temple clothing, but I'm guessing it's not. But they're doing some sort of art performance in blackface with just white around their eyes and their mouth, but the rest it's totally black. They're wearing some sort of baker's cap with aprons, which is weird. But the caption says 3 N-word minstrels from the Portsmouth MIA Roadshow, which was supported by members from the Lee Park and Gosport Ferrum branches. And again, what publication is this published in?
I think this is the Latter-day Saint Messenger and Advocate, if I recall. It's an international church magazine.
And around what year do you think?
This one right here was 1963.
Whoa.
Yeah. And so this had been going on. This had been going on, pictures like this ever since the 1920s. And when I shared one of my dear friends who passed away a year and a half ago or so, his name is Armand Moss. And for your Mormon listeners who may follow Mormon racial history, they'll know his name. Anyway, he was a sociology professor at Washington State University, professor of sociology and religion, and he retired to California. Anyway, so he wrote some great work on race and Mormons and also other topics over the years. Well, I had Armin, before he passed, he read about 6 of the 10 chapters of this book. And when he read this stuff here, he wrote me an email and he said, Matt, I'm afraid to admit this, but I remember in our California ward, so Armin would have been working on his doctorate degree at Berkeley at the time in the late 60s when he lived in Northern California. And he said, I remember in my California ward that we would do fundraisers with blackface. I am ashamed to admit this. This is 1969, but we did it. And I talked to a relative in my family who's in their 70s now, and I'll leave their name out. They might not want their name known, but anyway, my relative said that I'm afraid when I was a youth in the 60s, we did blackface all the time. We thought nothing of it. And so this is going on. When they said we did it, they're talking about at church as part of a church function. And so this is common in church circles well into the 1960s.
I have a question for you, Matt. So you have talked about this being very common on American culture. I do want to ask, since this is a part of what you teach as history of Black people in American society. Were there people who were white people and or others who were against this type of practices and discourse in America, or was it so widespread that there was nobody thinking this was wrong at the time? Do you have any sense of that?
Yeah, it does. So just to before I answer your question directly, just want to go back in time just for a quick moment. So some of your listeners, if you recall from history that you may have learned, called Jim Crow, it's just really what it came to mean over time was Jim Crow segregation. So when you say somebody practiced Jim Crow, it just really meant segregation. But Jim Crow was an actual figure that began in the 1830s. And so the idea would be that Jim Crow and his associates, they were Black people, and they decided to put on a minstrel show, a dancing show for white people. And they would just act goofy on the stage. They would jump a lot. That's where the term jumping Jim Crow came from. And so they're kowtowing to white audiences by exaggerating what Black people do for entertainment. So they're just taking money from all of this and capitalizing. And so over time, white people start to engage in this practice. They're trying to get on the cut, if you will. So they pretend to be Black people by donning charcoal and blackface. And when Black people in the 20th century recognize that white people are doing this, they're offended in any number of ways, and they start to try to reclaim sort of this practice. But they do push back on this because it's basically a racist caricature of Black people. And by the 1950s and 60s, Black people are writing in national publications that white people should not be doing this. And of course, racism is so entrenched in the United States at the time. I mean, most people just dismiss it.
Yeah, and the only reason I asked this, and I know, I wouldn't ask you to comment on it. I do want to mention it though, is because I mean, growing up Mormon, I was taught that these men, the top leaders, are supposed to see ahead and are supposed to be above these practices, right? So if there's people at the time calling out this practice is problematic, it saddens me that they couldn't see it, and even though they try to portray this idea that they can transcend culture and practice, but yeah, that's
and if it's okay if I add to that, Matt, add to what Gerardo's saying, like for those who are never Mormon, Mormons are taught that the prophet speaks to and for Jesus and God, full stop. It's the Mormon prophet is God's mouthpiece on the earth, and the only designated mouthpiece on the earth. So in this case, it would have been Joseph F. Smith, Heber J. Grant, George Albert Smith, David O. McKay. They would have all been God's one chosen spokesperson on the earth. And all the apostles, as I understand it, are sustained as prophets, seers, revelators, and as special witnesses of Christ. And so, like you said, Gerardo, the term prophet or seer or revelator, the whole point is that they're ahead, that they see before. And when you think about this, just this photo that we just saw, it's 1963, like this, Lyndon B. Johnson passes the Civil Rights Act in 1964. Martin Luther King starts the civil rights movement in the mid 1950s. So obviously 1978 is not only not early or on time, but it's like super late. But this is, and then if you add to it what you write so eloquently in your book about David O. McKay and people like Talmage just not agreeing with the way the doctrine is taught around Black people, you just know they don't agree. And they even have private correspondence. You have private correspondence of, I believe, David O. McKay and I believe it's Lowell Benyon, where David O. McKay is just making it clear he's not fully on board. Two questions come up for me. One is, what does it mean? What does it mean to be a prophet, seer, and revelator, and an apostle and a special witness of Christ? If you're not only not ahead and you're not even on time, but you're 10 to 15 years late. That's part one of my question. What does it even mean to be a prophet, seer, and revelator, and a special witness of Christ? And then the second part is, where's the courage if we know that Talmage and McKay at a minimum disagreed, the fact that they would stay quiet and not want to really cause a ruckus and kind of keep their opinions to themselves in private letters, I can see a practical nature where they don't want to cause dissension and problems. But we're going to be talking next episode about Lowry Nelson and, dissenters that do speak up. And I would just expect people designated as prophets, seers, and revelators and special witnesses of Christ to show extra courage, not to kind of just hide and keep quiet for their moral convictions, especially when we're talking about a decent percentage of God's children. Now, that's me expressing my feelings as someone raised as a devout Mormon and the frustrations and the disparities of what I was taught versus what I learned when I scratched underneath the surface. I don't, Matt, expect you to really even want to say much about that as a historian, but I did need to voice what I think is what many Mormons who learn about this history struggle with, is what does it mean to be a prophet, seer, and revelator and a special witness of Christ as a Mormon leader? And where's the courage of those who disagreed but stayed silent publicly?
Well, wow, that's a lot. So in the preface to my book, I write something that I want to just read quickly, and I'm quoting on Roman numeral 15, the great American writer Ralph Waldo Emerson, and he noted, quote, that the ideas of the time are in the air and infect all those who breathe it. And I think that I know that Latter-day Saints are not immune to this. Leaders are not immune to this, right? If you're growing up in a culture that where these racist tropes are pervasive in American magazines and American visual culture, and you're around something we haven't talked about yet, but a lot of these leaders who grew up in the late 19th, early 20th century, they're not around Black people. They're in the Utah Territory. Black people are few and far between, and so they're not comfortable with Black people. They don't know them. They're not friends with them. And so a lot of their views of race are informed by how they read the scripture and how they hear, from Brigham Young and others. And so when John Widtsoe and David O. McKay have problems with the church's race theology, I don't know if it's a matter of being a coward or holding back, or I guess the way that I look at it is a lot of these guys are very pragmatic. I mean, John Widtsoe didn't hold back. I mean, I have letters where he's talking about his views about race to the church president. And in a Quorum of the 12 meeting, not once, but many times, he's promoting this idea that biracial people should be able to experience the full rituals of the church. And I think as a strategist that John Widtsoe recognizes it would be easier to lift this ban if you could get biracial people ordained first, rather than go for the full enchilada. And we're going to learn this in chapter 4. One of the people who absolutely detest the ban, so much so that he'll get dropped from his position as a member of the First Presidency, a guy named Hugh B. Brown. I mean, he's one of the biggest, most vociferous activists within the highest echelons of church leadership. He does all kinds of things to make his views known about the ban. And we'll get into that later. But David O. McKay and Widtsoe, they know they don't have the numbers. In order to make these policy changes, there has to be unanimity according to Mormon scripture. And Widtsoe and McKay, they know that they don't have the numbers. And so I guess I'm putting thoughts into their head, but why push to end something when you know you're not going to succeed? And so what they do is, especially Widtsoe, and others will do this too, is they'll push to ordain biracial people, light-skinned biracial people to the priesthood, and to give them certain privileges within the church. But the hardliners are in control. They control the church leadership at the time, and they're not going to have anything of it. Their racial proclivities are too deep to do this. In terms of your other question about what does it mean to be a prophet, seer, and a revelator, I mean, those are faith questions, of course, right? And every Latter-day Saint, could struggle with these kinds of things about what it means if the church leaders were not at the vanguard of racial progressivism in the 20th century. But my response to that is your expectations of what a prophet is, or a church leader in general, not just Mormon leader, but religious leader in general, are really quite high, because you're asking somebody in the 20th century to buck their culture, to buck the environment in which they were reared. It's just not going to happen. Every religious person that we know of, they're the sum total of their own environment. And I think that these folks are doing the best they can in the environment they grew up in. My if I can be preachy just for 20 seconds, my thing that I say to church leaders, and some of whom I have friends who are in church leadership, and I frequently tell them, the biggest issue with the church today is they're trying to hide these kinds of things, that somebody was a racist. I mean, imagine this, right? You're born in 1899 and you have racist views towards Black people. I mean, why is that so hard for people to understand, that you're a product of your environment? And I think one of the issues with when Spencer Kimball, his son, published his book on his father and his ministry, they really pushed back on the idea that Edward Kimball said that his father had strong views on race. In other words, that was a nice way of son saying dad was a racist. I mean, imagine that. He grew up in the early 20th century when people had such strong racial views. But yet Desert Book didn't want that in the book. They just refused to allow Ed to say these kinds of things. And Ed and I both just puzzled when we talked about this. We scratched our heads and we thought, it would do the church a better service if they would just openly acknowledge that people are products of their time. And I think the redemptive story here, particularly with Spencer Kimball, is how he's able to overcome these racist views in order to permit Black men and women into the full rituals of the church. And that to me is the story. But creating somebody, this fiction that they're not influenced as much by their culture is just not sustainable.
Yeah. If I could just speculate just for just 1 minute or two, I think one of the reasons why they do this is because I mean, just the way you were talking about all this apostles, Joseph Fielding Smith, even Spencer W. Kimball, right, as a product of their time. I wish that's the way Mormons would talk about their prophets today when they go out and speak about LGBT people or, you know, women's issues. But that's not how Mormons speak about their prophets today. And I think that's one of the reasons why the brethren would be concerned about members starting to see that prophets are actually a product of their time, because it starts calling into question, well, today Russell M. Nelson or Dowling H. Oaks, how much are they a product of their time and what they're saying?
Yeah. And I love this give and take. And Matt, I love that you're encouraging a more mature or wise or practical or reasonable view of human leadership, let alone LDS church leadership. If I could just give you just a tiny finishing pushback a little bit. If Mormons like myself, like others, have too high of an expectation of Mormon church leaders, I think we come by it honestly. And I'll just, give 3 brief examples. If we look at Doctrine and Covenants, the very first section of the Doctrine and Covenants, this is Jesus talking, right? In Mormon scripture, you mentioned the 4, books of the canon of Mormon scripture. This is one of the 4, Doctrine and Covenants, Joseph Smith's Revelations. And this is Jesus talking in Joseph Smith's first revelation of the Doctrine and Covenants, section 1, verse 38. What I, the Lord, have spoken, I have spoken, and I excuse not myself. And though the heavens and the earth pass away, my word shall not pass away, but shall all be fulfilled, whether by mine own voice, or by the voice of my servants. And this is Jesus talking, whether by mine own voice or by the voice of my servants, it is the same. And then if you add to that, the types of quotes we were raised on, which was, when the brethren have spoken, the thinking has been done. The brethren will not lead you astray. That was a common saying that we all learned growing up Mormon. And there's even the primary hymn that we all learned and taught: follow the prophet, follow the prophet, follow the prophet, don't go astray. Like, that's how we're taught to believe, that they speak for Jesus. That's the whole point of them being prophets. So there's got to be some give and take, or some balance between, yes, having pragmatic, temporal, realistic expectations for these men who lead a church, and what they all seem to lead the membership to think and feel and believe, which is that we sustain them as special witnesses of Christ, and that they literally speak to and for Jesus. Am I being totally unfair, Matt? Or can you see that there needs to be some balance? Because in 2024, there's a hemorrhaging in the Mormon church membership. And I think part of it is the church suffering from the expectations that they helped set up in its membership.
Well, I think, there's certainly a number of Latter-day Saints who have those expectations about what the church leaders are and what they're not. And when those expectations aren't met, of course, they're disappointed, and some even leave the church. And my feeling is that, lower your expectations, for one. And for two, I don't want to be critical, but, I've told people within my ear reach with any influence, the brethren ought to just sort of tone it down a little bit about what they're capable of doing and not doing. And that way, people's expectations won't be dashed. I know one of the questions I asked once to the late Doug Alder is a friend of mine. He was a professor of history at Utah State University for a number of years. And I met him at Dixie State University when I taught there in the early 21st century. And he had just retired as a Dixie State president, and he taught some classes in the history department. So I got to know Doug well. And for your audience, he's also a prominent Mormon historian. He wrote a lot about Mormons, particularly Mormons in the West. Anyway, I remember one day we went to one summer, we had a lengthy trip, the faculty, to Cambridge and Oxford, England. We had a grant, and we studied various subjects in Cambridge and University and Oxford University that summer. And it was really a wonderful experience. I remember sitting with Doug on the airplane, and I said, "Doug, you taught Mark Hoffman, didn't you?" And he said, "Yes, I did. And I knew him well." And I said, "Did you ever have any idea that he would go on and be a mass forger and murderer?" And he said, "Oh, of course not." And it was sort of a rhetorical question, but he answered it. And anyway, I said, what do you make of the sense that he was able to fool the brethren? What does it mean to be a seer to you? And if he was able to pass these forgeries off to the point where the church would spend, a lot of money purchasing them. And Doug said, "I don't know. I'm not sure." And I think a lot of Latter-day Saints are still trying to figure out what it means to be a prophet, seer, and a revelator, particularly in the context where Joseph Smith produced, any number of revelations. And then Brigham Young, of course, produced a few, and then they sort of taper off over time. And I think that some Latter-day Saints have the expectation that the church leaders still ought to be producing new revelations that people could read and discuss and analyze, just like early leaders of the church did. And so their expectations are different in terms of what they mean a prophet, seer, and a revelator to mean. And I think a lot of saints are like Doug Alder, who's he was a temple sealer. He was a very orthodox Latter-day Saint man. And even in his mind, he didn't have a good answer for, what it meant to be a seer in the modern era.
Love it. Well, this has been a fantastic second episode. I'm really loving our decision to do this series. And we're perfectly now teed up for, I think, is one of the most inspiring and courageous stories and entertaining stories in all of 20th century Mormon history, which is the story of Lowry Nelson and the swearing elders, right? And other dissidents within the church, along with also the church starting to have to grapple with the implications of these teachings as they start to expand, as the missionary work starts to expand across the world. Anything you want to say, Matt, just as a conclusion to today and as a preview for part 3 of the series?
Yeah, so just to remind people that it's just critically important that Latter-day Saints are not unique in their racial attitudes. I mean, John, you'd posted a couple of really graphic accounts from church magazines. I know that's really graphic, but I'm telling you, if you were to go to your local library or somehow get access to a digital database online to look at some old magazines, American magazines, you would see similar things. And so I'm not justifying, I'm not excusing it. I'm just trying to simply say that Mormons are not unique in their racism. And so just to recap, we've been talking about various theories about the ban that are existing. And Joseph Fielding Smith tried to systematize the church's teachings. He was commissioned by the church leadership to do this. And the next episode tomorrow, or when we get to it, we're going to talk about a former BYU professor, sociology professor named Lowry Nelson, who's the first time that I know of who pushes back in a very massive way on the church's racial teachings. And it forces them to codify church teachings in a formalized statement. And by 1949, the church's race teachings will move from a policy and a practice to a fixed doctrine. And this is something that most Latter-day Saints don't understand, that it wasn't doctrinal until the mid-20th century. And then once that statement's created, it takes on a life of its own.
Yeah. So those first presidency statements become key to future, backtracking or denunciation. So it's all very, very fascinating. And understand, I just didn't know. I knew that there were a couple first presidency affirmations of the priesthood ban. I had no idea the historical stories that pushed or led to those statements. And that's, again, why this book is a must own, a must purchase, and a must read, and a must share. It's Second Class Saints, Black Mormons and the Struggle for Racial Equality by Dr. Matthew Harris. You can pre-order it now or purchase it, depending on when you're listening to it, on Amazon, at Benchmark Books, wherever you like to buy your books. Please buy this book. buy it for friends and family. It'll make a perfect Christmas gift. Let's learn from this book, and let's share it with others, and let's also make sure scholars like Matt are handsomely rewarded for their incredible scholarship. I will also just add again that this series depends on your financial support. We've done 2 episodes. We want to do somewhere between 10 and 20. And that's just going to depend on your financial support. So if you go to the link in the description, or if you go to donorbox.org/Matt Harris and you become a monthly donor, if we can just get 100, 200 people to donate $10 a month or $20 a month or $50 a month or $100 a month, whatever you can afford, all that money is going to go to Matt. We're not going to skim any money off of that. And it's just going to pay for future episodes. We're going to pay him no matter what, but we want to pay him exactly what he's worth, if not generously. And it's going to depend on your support. So please become a monthly donor to this project. Please know that this podcast series is available as a standalone series on Spotify. We're still trying to finalize our name. We're thinking the name is going to be Inside Mormon Leadership, the Struggle for Racial Equality. We haven't created the logo yet, but we will by the time we release this. But you can get on Spotify, you can get on Apple Podcasts, and there'll be a YouTube playlist on the Mormon Stories podcast channel where you can just binge watch or listen to these episodes. They're best consumed in sequence, and we'll also integrate them into the Mormon Stories podcast feed. Gerardo, any final words?
No, other than that, it just gets better. I honestly, like, the next chapters and pages are insane. Like, blow your mind.
It's unbelievable to say you ain't seen nothing yet. Is that fair to say, Matt Harris?
That is fair to say.
The blackface and N-word poems, and literally you ain't seen nothing yet. Is that right?
Yeah. Especially with the leadership. When we get in the 20th century, we're going to start to see personalities emerge. We just mentioned a little bit today with Elder Widsoe and Elder McKay, but when we go forward on, we're going to meet a whole host of new characters who are pivotal to the story.
Yeah. So thanks Gerardo for making this possible. Thanks, Matt, for joining us and for giving us your precious time.
Absolutely, I enjoyed it.
And thanks to Julia and Maven and Brooklyn and our board at the Open Stories Foundation. All of them make all this possible. So a huge thanks to them. And thanks to our donors that make Mormon Stories and the Open Stories Foundation possible as well. Please check back for other episodes. Give us your feedback at mormonstories@gmail.com. You can also comment in these episodes. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel, our Facebook and Instagram and TikTok channels as well. And please like these episodes, share them, because that helps with the algorithms and helps get this stuff published far and wide. Again, buy this book and share it. And if you want, I mean, you can buy The Way to Perfection. It at least is an interesting read. I don't know, Matt and Gerardo, do you guys recommend that people buy this book?
At least cut out chapters 15 and 16.
Buy the Portuguese version of this book. You'll really enjoy it, The Way to Perfection. Anyway, be good to each other. Be kind to each other. We'll see you all again soon on another episode of Mormon Stories Podcast. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.